A common misconception with quality assurance for those outside of the games industry is that it's a role where you play video games all day long as a career. While this may sound like the dream job for some, the reality of how QA actually operates is far more complex. It requires a lot of observation, critical thinking, communication, time management, project planning, strategy building, and in some cases developer software knowledge. Quality assurance is a vital part of the development process for making and releasing a game. If a QA team isn't present or has their reported issues overlooked, the game is at high risk of being completely unplayable or absolutely riddled with bugs, making it very difficult to market to an audience. So how does QA actually work? How does a tester conduct their work when testing a product? Let's take a dive into the wondrous world of quality assurance testing and best practices. Let's start with a bit of information on how QA would approach a new build. This is Brian, he'll be our quality assurance tester. Let's imagine that this room is a build of a game. It's quite bare right now, but the developers have added some new features for Brian to test today. The build has a sofa, TV, and a fireplace. Brian will need to thoroughly check all these items to make sure that they work properly. Before Brian begins testing these features, he will need to write up checklists to outline each feature, instructions on how to get to them, and what the intended action of the feature should be. We refer to these as test cases. Here is an example of a test case based on the items that Brian has to check. This will aid him on making sure that all the features are tested thoroughly. Now we'll take a look at some of the common playtest methods that QA do in their day-to-day tasks. Let's try the sofa first. Can Brian sit on the sofa? Yes, great. Can Brian sit on the other side of the sofa? Perfect. Can Brian take a nap on the sofa? Wonderful. It seems that the sofa is working as intended. Now let's try the TV. Does the TV turn on? It does. Do all of the channels work? Yes. Do they all play audio? Yes, they do. Does the TV turn off? Yes, it does. I think Brian's a bit bored of the TV now, but it's all part of the checklist. Okay, next the fireplace. Does it switch on? Good. Can Brian warm himself by the fireplace? Yes, he can, though I can't imagine it's comfortable in a bare suit. Well, that's excellent, everything seems to be working. This method of testing is known as functionality testing, where everything that has a functional purpose must be checked to ensure it functions correctly. Functionality testing is the most common method of playtesting for QA. As the build develops over time, testers will need to perform this method on every new feature that gets implemented into the build. Over the course of the week, the developers send a new build over to Brian for him to test. Some days things are working fine, and other days things are broken. Bugs tend to occur as new changes come in, and it's important that Brian lets the developers know what issues are occurring. The developers have fixed some bugs from the previous build, and these fixes are now submitted into the new build sent over today. Brian now needs to check that these fixes have worked, and that no further bugs have appeared as a result of those fixes. This testing method is known as regression testing. Sometimes bugs that were fixed in a previous build may come back up again in a new one, due to the ongoing changes that a build goes through during its production cycle. This can be a common occurrence. Today a new stereo has been added to the build. Brian is now going to listen to the stereo and dance to it for several hours. He does this to make sure that the stereo can continue playing and that he can continue dancing indefinitely. This testing method is known as soak testing. Soak testing is an important factor, as it simulates real-life situations where a player may leave their console running for a long period of time. We don't want the build crashing and losing their saved data, so we perform this method frequently to check that the build can sustain long periods of no user input and still run. So far, Brian has been testing the build on his fancy work PC with a nice graphics card and HD screen, but as we know, not every player has the same setup. If the game that Brian is working on is a PC game, he will need to test the build on multiple different specs and screen resolutions to check that compatibility is available for players. The same goes if a build was a mobile game. Brian would have to test the game on multiple different phones. This testing method is known as compatibility testing. As technology advances and becomes even better, it's important to remember that not everyone will have the latest gaming PC or mobile phone to play games at their highest performance level. Most games have options in their display menus that allow the user to alter the level of rendering, performance, resolution, and various VFX properties to best work with their setup. Brian is testing a multiplayer game today. His fellow testers are here to join in. Brian's test team is playing the game online with the developers in a playtest session. The maximum limit of players who can join the game is capped at 80 users. For the next week, all 80 spots are filled with the team for playtest runs for multiple hours a day. This test method is known as stress testing. QA conducts this method to ensure that the game can handle maximum capacity, with users joining and inputting data into a game all at once. This is performed over and over again, to monitor how the build manages this data over continuous gameplay. As we know, not all users play games the same way. Today Brian is going to test a game and deliberately try to break it. He's going to perform interactions that aren't considered the linear way of playing, and do actions that would be considered abnormal player behavior. This method is known as destructive testing. Destructive testing is a very important part of QA strategy, as it can generate bugs that developers haven't planned for with implemented logic or design. There are going to be players who will look for exploits in video games, stray from objectives in general, and make content for the memes. Games need to be prepared for those scenarios, so that when such actions are performed, that minimal bugs are caused as a result. Brian has been given a specific list of checks to do today on a console game. These specific tests are classed as high priority. They cover things such as button and control terminology, naming conventions, appearance of login screen, and copyrighted material. This method is known as compliance testing. All platforms have a set of guidelines that a game must follow. Failure to pass these guidelines could result to missing a deadline for release, costing the publisher a lot of money. Age rating also factors into part of the legal process for game development. If your game includes any references to drugs, violence, alcohol, sex, or use of profanity, the age rating will be determined on how much of these are present. Age rating also differs per country, so it's important to familiarize with each age rating specifics on the country you plan to release your game to. The company Brian works for plans to release the game to several countries. They will need to be altered to accommodate different languages for audiences. This means that testers who speak other languages fluently need to test the game under these settings. This is known as localization testing. Brian speaks Bear, so he'll be testing a build under the Bear language settings. He'll need to make sure that all dialogue, subtitles, and text is correct in his target language. Games come in all shapes and sizes. Some are small and only require a handful of testers. Others, like AAA titles, require a much larger team. As it's sometimes impossible to acquire enough QA to cover everything in a large title, companies use computers to automate gameplay and record information without any human input. This is known as automation testing. Automation testing speeds up the process to checks that involve a certain feature or gameplay run-through. It can generate through multiple play sessions a day and display errors found. Automation will only carry out checks that it has been programmed to automate, therefore testing such as destructive wouldn't be a viable pathway for this testing method. Now that we've gone through playtesting methods, here's a quick explanation on how QA would report an issue to a developer. It's important that Brian gives the developers as much information as possible when writing a ticket. Saying the toilet is broken, and giving no further context, isn't really helpful. If the developer receives a bug report that just says the toilet is broken, they'll need to know what actions the tester did to make the bug happen. And what happens when the user attempts to interact with the toilet. QA follows a bug template to communicate over the problem more efficiently. They'll often contain a small summary, steps to reproduce, a video of the bug happening, and any other files that the developers may need, such as crash logs if a crash occurs. All the issues that QA find in a build will need compiling into a final report. This is commonly referred to as a build health report or daily status report. The document outlines what bugs were found and how high risk they are to the project. Bugs that cause crashes and hangs would be classed a highest priority. Bugs such as a plant clipping slightly into a table would be classed as lower priority. Reports help monitor how healthy the build is and what bugs need immediate attention. QA will live, breathe, and sleep bugs throughout their career. They will see every bug in a game from the start of its development until the end of it. And while they don't fix bugs, they certainly get a laugh out of seeing them. I conclude this educational video with a funny bug montage. We hope you enjoyed learning about QA and playtesting methods. If you fancy taking QA as a future career, feel free to reach out to any of us. We don't bite, but we do bug. Cheerio!